started. It's mostly 1:30 somewhere. Close enough. All right. Welcome to the afternoon session of the Board of Ed. Work session, I guess. We are delighted today to have a person with a title that I always wanted to have. Chief School Readiness Officer, I think, is the coolest title out there.
Thank you, Dan.
You are so welcome. I'm envious. But mostly, I think as everybody knows, the Commonwealth is certainly making it a priority to emphasize pre-K education. There is a genuinely heartfelt sentiment that improving pre-K will improve results in K-12. And I understand that once again, there'll be a legislative effort to move pre-K into the ambit of the Board of Ed and the Department of Ed, all of which I think we view as a positive thing. So to bring us up to date, I guess, on the executive directive and other things going on in the Commonwealth, we have Jenna Conway, who I guess most of us know already, and not many folks in the audience don't know you. So
Excellent.
Welcome.
Thank you.
And thank you for making the time for us.
Absolutely. Thank you all, board members, this afternoon. Very glad to be here. Obviously, been working very closely with Dr. Lane, the Department of Social Services, the other state agencies, and the governor's office. It's a kind of I'm officially an appointment of the Department of Education, but literally split time between this building and the Patrick Henry building, making sure as we're thinking about transforming our early childhood care and education system that we're doing it in a way that's thoughtful and kind of interagency. What I'd like to do, and this is a bit of content, so just take you through high level, give you a sense of the governor's charge this summer, as he's asked us to look across the Department of Education, Department of Social Services, other agencies, and what it might take to strengthen school readiness in the state. Talk a little bit about what our findings were and what we've presented to him in terms of the implications for the 2020 General Assembly, some of which I discussed this morning around legislation and potential appropriations. I also want to talk a little bit about the federal preschool development grant, some other resources that we have been lead agency on as the Department of Education, and how we're working with communities to measure and improve access and quality. Also kind of unique to this presentation is kind of the answer to the question why the Board of Education and Department of Education, and how, based on what we know about Virginia kids and using Virginia data, why this is so important to your overall strategy for equity. And so when you really look at, oftentimes folks don't use those words in the same sentence, early childhood and equity, but if you take the lens that you all have embraced in recent years and apply it to the birth to 4 spectrum, one of the things you'll find is that we can't really tackle kind of giving every child in the Commonwealth opportunity without looking at the birth to 4 space. And so a few slides kind of to that as well. What I'll do is try to take you through high level and then hold a good amount of time for questions. I know this can be in the weeds. I will try to avoid using initials as much as is possible. I swear that the early childhood sector often makes it more complicated than it needs to be. As Dr. Mann can attest, and I know she's disappointed to not be here this week. But really kind of at its core, thinking about, regardless of setting, how do we give kids the set of experiences that prepares them not only cognitively, but with those key social skills, self-regulation skills that they need to be successful in school and beyond. So the key challenge, and this is relatively new data with us having by the end of this calendar year a apples to apples baseline for our entire state, is that as we go beyond just using PALS to measure kindergarten readiness, our kids are not coming to our kind of K-12 system as prepared as we maybe thought they were. When we expand beyond the literacy indicators and we look at early math and we look at self-regulation and we look at social skills, at least 40% of our kids across the Commonwealth are entering our kindergarten classrooms not fully ready, not fully prepared to maximize their potential. When we look at kids who from economically disadvantaged backgrounds, that drops to half, right? And so already from the get-go, ago. Our kindergarten teachers, our elementary school systems are playing catch up. And as I'll share a little bit later, that gap on the first day of school might be the greatest than it is any other point. And so we might have the narrative all wrong. Our K-12 system might be doing a really good job of catching kids up, but they were starting, 3 and 4 and 5 years behind when they entered the doors of K-12. A part of this is a function of access. So we'll talk a little bit more about this, but if kids don't have access to high quality birth to 5 experiences, then they can't learn and grow. And the other part of this is quality. So where are kids being served? As I'll talk a little bit more, we've got a whole lot of kids that may not be in part of our formal care and education programs, and they're less likely to get an experience that helps them develop those literacy, math, and social emotional skills. Although Virginia normally looks great on a lot of rankings, early childhood is a place where you're going to find that Virginia doesn't score as well. 33rd in the nation on preschool funding, 37th in the nation on early childhood governance. It's like the problem that we don't want to talk about. And part of the reason that the Northams reached out to me immediately following their election. I'm actually a Virginia native. I'm a product of the Charlottesville Public Schools all the way through, and had worked in Louisiana around kind of unifying their system. And they felt when they looked more deeply at this data that there was a real concern on how Virginia was doing. The most immediate thing that the governor asked us to look at this summer, and so we've been kind of working on this really since I arrived about a year and a half ago, but this summer the governor turned it up a notch with Executive Directive 4 and really said, all right, agencies, we don't know what will happen in November, we don't know where we'll go from here, but I'd like you to do some work around understanding what would it take to move the needle and serve all of our at-risk 3s and 4s, knowing that those are the kids that are most likely to be at risk of not entering school ready. What would it take to build a more uniform quality measurement and improvement system across family homes, childcare, Head Start, and pre-K in the schools? And how might we better organize ourselves? How do we go from being 37th in the nation to governance to being kind of a national model for early childhood? The key piece, and Dr. Lane and Commissioner Storn from Social Services were key partners in this, was just getting us out on the road. The First Lady has toured the state up and down over 5,000 miles, I believe she reported this morning, but really wanted sort of Dr. Lane, Commissioner Storn, and I to go out and hear from people in terms of what do we think is holding us back in school readiness. 4 road stops later, 300 plus people that include everybody from libraries to sort of childcare centers to business groups. And we were able to kind of hear from the state, and that helped inform our responses to the governor. One of the most compelling takeaways from this group was that folks are very excited on this focus on early childhood. So whether it's a parent who's saying, childcare is unaffordable to me, I need somebody to pay attention to this because I have to navigate this maze, whether it's a kindergarten teacher saying, listen, the literacy and the math is not that hard. I mean, it's important, but like the thing that I'm spending most of my year on, and the reason that my kids aren't making as much progress as they'd like is because some of those self-regulation and social skills, that's what's taking up all of my time. The principal who's saying, I want to figure out how to do something different with early childhood because I feel like there's got to be a tie between what's coming in my doors and how I'm doing when it comes to 3rd grade reading. So the first thing, and you'll notice kind of throughout this, is trying to kind of really define the problem before we get to the recommendations to really make sure we understand what we're trying to solve for. So the first piece is around the kind of access. And the governor said, we recognize that across the birth to 5 spectrum, that there's a lot of kids that are falling through the cracks. We do want you to focus on at-risk 3s and 4s for the purpose of this exercise, largely because we know that that's such an important 2 years before kindergarten, and because we feel like that's supposed to start. Obviously, we need to kind of also, keep infants and toddlers in mind. A couple of key stats for you all to know, because I think what I'm struck by is sometimes, we're not all familiar with this. 2/3 of kids under the age of 6 in the Commonwealth have all available parents in the workforce. So, versus a decade ago, 2 decades ago, 3 decades ago, that was not as true. You could support a family on one income. You had a lot more sort of dual parent households. And so having a parent, most often mom, stay home was often commonplace, right? And the sense was K-12 was when she started on formal education, but it was really a family responsibility. That's changed, right? Whether it's the economic situation, whether it's the parental makeup, but the practical reality is when you look at kids under the age of 6, 2/3 of them have all available parents in the workforce. So if they're not in pre-K or they're not in formal care, they're somewhere. friend, neighbors, unlicensed care, schlepping around, getting shuffled around. Who knows what they're getting? We also know that infant care early childhood care has gotten prohibitively expensive. Infant care now costs more than college. Full stop. More than college in the Commonwealth, more than in-state tuition. There's not a FAFSA, there's no Pell, there's not endowments, right? So already you've got sort of a huge chasm between haves and have-not. Even 4-year-old care in the private sector is nearly $11,000 a year, right? And so when you look at, if you don't happen to get that Head Start or that VPI slot, you have to pay more than a car. You'd have to pay more than college to kind of get your kid that opportunity. And by the way, while you can finance college and you can finance your car, it's nearly impossible to finance early childhood care and education. You have to pay out of pocket. So so at its core, early child funding is an equity strategy because nearly all of the public dollars are dedicated towards at-risk, economically disadvantaged kids with special needs. And yet, we just need more of those resources. That said, as we looked at the problem more deeply this summer, we also realized that funding alone won't solve this. And so I look at Dr. Duran and sort of Northern Virginia. There you might have enough resources. You don't have enough classrooms, right? So there's a physical limitation. We found in other parts of the state, Southwest Virginia, we had sort of odd numbers of kids, and you can't make a classroom work if you've got 8 4-year-olds, right? You might pay enough per kid, but that assumes that you're going to have 18 kids in that classroom, and the economics don't work. So we found a range of problems, some of which was related to the total amount of funding, and some of which was related to how VPI is structured. And then, as we found, and it's pretty sort of stunning evidence, when you look at the kids who participate in VPI and you look at those kindergarten readiness results as compared to those who have no experience, there's a stark difference in terms of who's ready. So this gives you a sense of the unserved at-risk children by age. And again, this is why early childhood is so complicated. If you look at the letters on that chart, it almost, you feel like it's the entire alphabet. But you see you've got a range of options for 4-year-olds, fewer for 3s, and then it's, almost nothing for infants and toddlers. It also, you see that the unserved gap is smaller at 4, so we're doing well, but want to kind of close that entirely. And then I think the real opportunity in terms of moving the needle in the Commonwealth is those 3s, so that you have a 2-year experience that helps kids catch up, be ready for the classroom, be fully prepared by the time they enter kindergarten. We did recommend, the governor had asked us to say, what would it take to serve all at-risk 3s and 4s? And based on the sheer volume and the current Virginia context, we encourage a more incremental approach, which we recommended to him. If you were to offer a slot to all at-risk 3s and 4s, you'd have to add 47,000 to 50,000 kids, which is like 10,000 a year. And I think we had some concern whether or not the system was ready to kind of do that in terms of the physical, like having enough classrooms, having enough educators. We already know there's a teacher shortage. And so what we ended up proposing to the governor was a smaller expansion of VPI to include 3-year-olds and the mixed delivery to include 3-year-olds. And I'll explain more in a second, but just wanted to note that again, although that was what was asked of us by our boss, this kind of came back with a more incremental recommendation based on where we are. The recommendations on access, kind of 3 big ones. I think the first of which is we recommend to the governor that he continue to maximize all of the federal funding. And so one of the things, and I said this morning and we'll reiterate this, oftentimes when we have the conversation about early child, we only talk about the state dollars, or we only talk about the local dollars or the federal dollars. The reality is that there's no single funding source or provider type that can serve all kids birth to 5. And so it's fundamentally going to take public-private partnership and a range of sources. And so really emphasizing to him, we need to sort of from the state level recognize the importance of these federal resources. We also proposed a restructuring of VPI. So to kind of start to, similar to what we do for K-12, look at benchmarking to the costs of quality. Looking at how in those places where you don't have enough physical classrooms, you can look at partnering with the private sector, kind of bringing in private childcare, using available classrooms, helping to professionalize and connect those classrooms, increasing operational flexibility. So looking at some of the requirements and how you might provide some more flexibility to divisions, and then enabling same-year reallocation. So right now, and some of you heard me give this example before, we have a community in the state that has 44 kids, 44 4-year-olds on a wait list. They have 3 available classrooms through public-private partnership. They have a philanthropic donor and have talked with their supervisors about being able to make up the match. But they've hit their cap based on how the VPI formula is calculated. We do not have the ability, even though we know Northern Virginia will not use all their slots, even though we know other areas of the state will not use all their slots, we do not have the ability to take those 44 slots and give them to this community on Southside, which means basically that those 44 kids can't be served this year. And so we feel it's really imperative, even as we restructure VPI, that we fundamentally give the department the flexibility within any given year, being fair to all divisions, but to kind of reallocate and make sure slots can get used when kids need them. And lastly, I think we propose, as I noted before, that through both the VPI program and mixed delivery, which is where a community applies for dollars and works with private settings to offer what are equivalent to VPI classrooms, that we say we put money in those 2 buckets and work with communities to offer either 3-year-old only classrooms or 3- and 4-year-old classrooms. But the idea being that you sort of are catching more of those most vulnerable kids. You're giving them 2 years of full care and education before they even enter kindergarten. We would be committed to working with communities, with the superintendents, with the board of supervisors, with the private sector on kind of where they would want to put those dollars, and then also tracking kids to make sure that these are having positive results. When it comes to quality measurement, and I should note VPI is ahead of the game here, but fundamentally we have a problem where we don't know what we're getting for our investment. So I think roughly we're talking about nearly $400 million across all of the funding sources that goes into early childhood. And yet when we look at the things that matter most, the use of curriculum and measuring teacher-child interactions, we only know what's happening in 5% of our classrooms. Thanks to recent investments in the Virginia Preschool Initiative, by the end of this year, we will know that for all 1,300 of our VPI classrooms, which is exciting. But now we really need to kind of expand that and go beyond VPI, because a lot of our kids, 14,000 of our kids are in Head Start, 20,000 of our kids are in the subsidy program, but really kind of think about how we might build a system with all of our public and private partners to measure the elements that matter most in terms of preparing kids for kindergarten. This is also important in terms of getting this information to families. And I know when I moved to Richmond, a 1.5 years ago, it was extremely difficult to kind of find out information about programs. If you're not participating in Virginia Quality, what's at the pre-K, you got to go to the school quality profiles. Right now, if you're the parent of a 4-year-old, and you want to compare your options, there's one website for Head Start, there's another one for the school quality profiles, there's another one for licensing, and there's a 4th one for Virginia Quality, right? So really this idea that we're sending parents to 4 different websites in order just to find out kind of what their kid is likely to experience is just not sustainable, not sort of a way of really informing our parents as our children's first teachers. We propose gradually rolling this in over 3 years. We've started this work with the Preschool Development Grant and really focus in on the thing that is tied most closely to sort of better positive child outcomes, and that's looking at teacher-child interactions, which is measured by the CLASS tool from the University of Virginia. Somebody asked me this question. I always think it's important to say, are you talking about sort of SOLs or standardized tests for 2-year-olds? And we're not talking about that. First of all, that's practically impossible in terms of getting a kid to sit down, take a standardized test. Their development is way too variable. But why we like this measure of teacher-child interactions that's currently being used in all VPI classrooms. It looks at the warmth and responsiveness of all the educators in the classroom. It looks at the routines, and it looks at kind of age-appropriate learning, which, as you might imagine, slightly different for infants, toddlers, 3- and 4-year-olds. And there are a significant number of national studies that show that it does tie with better outcomes, including things like sort of better social skills. So it tries to kind of, it's that compromise between no way, shape, or form do we want high stakes tests for, for babies or for toddlers, but do want to measure what's happening in all classrooms so we can better support our educators and better support our families. From the oversight perspective, this kind of gives you a sample of the complexity. And I feel like this is my life right now in terms of if I want to get a decision made, these are all the boxes that I got to go to and check. But we have a fragmented oversight of our programs. Again, if you are a program that wants to serve, use a couple different funding sources, you now have to check in with multiple agencies at the local and state level. This is why we ended up being ranked 37th in the country. And it's very hard if you say, who is in charge in the Commonwealth beyond Mr. Gecker's point about my title, who's in charge of making sure that every kid, right, regardless of where you're born or where you come from, your background, it gets has access to a program that helps prepare them for school. Like there's 9 different agencies or 8 different agencies and, 22 different letters. And it's, a whole bunch of different health, safety, and quality expectations. And so we recommend to the governor that he establish one board, this board, and the one agency, the Department of Education, as responsible for the oversight and administration of early care and education out of the home. We think you should transition a very significant block grant, the Child Care and Development Block Grant, and the Head Start Collaboration Office to the Department of Education so they can be part of the Division of School Readiness. We wouldn't want to move everything. I think one of the things that's really unique to Virginia is Virginia has 120 local social services offices, and those are a key resource for families. They can go and apply for food assistance, housing assistance as they're looking to return to the workforce, and they can also apply for child care subsidy, and we'd want them to still be able to do that and to kind of have some of that case management. So we could contract back that to the State Department of Social Services, and they can work with the local offices. And then we'd ultimately want to move over licensing, the child care licensing, which is separate from teacher licensing, which talks about health and safety, knowing that, by kind of you want to align those health, safety, and quality expectations so that when you have the presence of the state in your center, your home, that we're speaking with one voice on what we want to see you're doing with your infants, your toddlers, your 3 and 4-year-olds. And there's a way to use, we think, technology sort of more strategically as we go forward to kind of influence practice across, a whole array. We think ballpark about 10,000 classrooms across the state. So that lays out kind of what we proposed. Again, we would propose moving this over within the Northam administration, but in kind of phases so that it was less disruptive, and with contracting some of those things back to social services. I should note this is not, we would not be the first in the country to do this, as I'll talk in a couple of seconds, that the child care development and block grant is a pretty sizable block grant, about $160, $180 million annually. And 50 states have 50 different approaches to who gets this grant, how they distribute it, how they use it to both support subsidy or vouchers for families to use in home or child care settings, and how they support quality. So when you think about kind of those two things, both access and quality, this grant covers that. It also is all the funding and the resources for licensing. So when we presented this to the governor and sort of, why Board of Education, why Department of Education, there's kind of 3 key reasons, then I'll add a 4th. I think the first of which is you've already got the kind of the core of pre-K education happening out of here. So you've got early childhood special education for our most vulnerable, 2.5-year-olds to 5-year-olds. You've got pre-K kind of happening out here. You've got already a third of your Head Start programs in the state are run by school divisions. And so it kind of makes sense to kind of run it out of education. If you look at our fundamental challenge around 3rd grade reading and really making sure that kids are coming to school and sort of learning what they need to finish the 3rd grade proficient, it makes a lot more sense for this to be here in terms of kind of building that full seamless pathway from birth through 8 or through 3rd grade. And then I think, some folks said, well, why not just keep a chief school readiness officer at the governor's office, kind of have that person run point? I think practically speaking, that works when everybody is so collegial and collaborative as they are now, but that doesn't necessarily sustain. And so when I was advised even sort of directly, would you want to stay at the governor's office? Would you want to create your own agency? Would you want to be at education? I've always said you want to be at education. Some of you know I spent my prior 6 years moving all of these things to the Louisiana Department of Education. I feel like when you look at which agency is thinking kind of whether that classroom is in a home setting or in a private setting or in a school setting, that core practice of intentionally supporting kids' learning and development, professionally supporting those educators and kind of connecting them to sort of PD systems and all of the resources that educators and families need, I feel like school is well positioned to do that. I also say that I think society has shifted. And so if you ask me personally why I pay more than my mortgage for the care and education of my 2-year-old and 4-year-old, it's because I expect it to be more than just health and safety. I really expect that where my kid goes to childcare is where they are actively supporting their learning and development. And I so think in terms of the respect, the professionalism, like kind of to call it education rather than, this is just health and safety, this is just babysitting, this is just a social service, I think is really important. Of the 10 states that have unified early childhood governance, most have done it also within education. And so again, some have done a standalone agency. We sort of had that conversation with some of the powers that be here in the Commonwealth. I think more government is not typically what's wanted. And, again, as I noted before, most have consolidated within education: California, DC, Florida, Louisiana, Maryland, Michigan, Oregon, with their own kind of office dedicated to that. A few have done it within Health and Human Services, just North Carolina that we know of. And then, so, as I said before, some coordinate through the governor's office. Although when I looked at Ohio, they had a great person similar to me. They had kind of a point person at the gov's office. When you looked at the regulations, though, they were still all over the place, completely discordant. It's just really hard for one person, no matter how great you might be, to kind of try to align all those things without the support of an agency behind you. From the equity perspective, so I tried to kind of think about, okay, how do you as a board who've been dedicated to saying our priority number one is equity, kind of tie in this work, right? Because there is, some additional work as the department expands. Dr. Lane and I have to find space for people, have to kind of dedicate sort of time and energy to managing this, to driving this strategy, to executing. So why, right? Why would you do this? And I think it kind of comes down to this sort of very stark contrast of how our not disadvantaged kids are kind of coming in, and that the gap between where they are and our disadvantaged kids is probably greatest on that first day of kindergarten. And so if you look at this chart, this is with the 2018 Virginia Kindergarten Readiness Program. And so again, this is literacy, math, self-regulation, and social skills. You see that 65% of our not economically disadvantaged kids are coming to school fully ready across all of those areas. In contrast, through no fault of their own, that only 50%, only half of our economically disadvantaged kids. And so that sort of 15% gap might, in fact, and we'll get final numbers this fall, might be greater than what we see in third grade, what we see kind of at other points in their educational trajectories. And it gets even worse. Part of the reason that number is so good, it's hard to believe that 50.5% is good, is because we've made investments in the last decade and a half in early childhood. If you look at the kids whose parents say, my kid did nothing, no Head Start, no VPI, no childcare, the year prior, only 38% of those kids are coming ready. So like 38%. So that number drops even precipitously. So you look at a kid who comes from, an advantaged background and a kid who's had no preschool from a disadvantaged background, and you're talking about, nearly a 30% difference in kind of where they're coming. And when you think about, as I'll show in the next slide, what that means for those kids, this chart shows kind of how your results at the beginning of kindergarten. So those are the folks who scored the lowest quintile on the PALS, the second, the third, the fourth, and the fifth. And then the sort of the top of the bar indicates how many are proficient, what percent are proficient by third grade. And so basically what this is saying is that if you come in, more likely to be economically disadvantaged, you're otherwise kind of vulnerable and at risk, you're not kind of on level, you're not ready, that we can almost predict, that at least half of you will not be ready, not be reading on level by third grade. In contrast, if we can get you in and you're ready, right, sort of in terms of at the fourth or fifth quintile, that, you have enough of that foundation. Our K-2 system can kind of get you to the place where you will finish the third grade, able to read, able to kind of have that pivot from, as you know, the learning to read to reading to learn. So again, this kind of stark chart on sort of what currently exists, how much your kind of economic background predicts your readiness, because largely the cost of childcare and the access limitations. And I think with that sort of most stark number of 38% of our kids who have no preschool experience are coming in ready. Very quickly, and then I'll open it up for questions. Wanted to give you a sense of what we've been doing with roughly about 27 divisions across the state so far. We did apply for a federal preschool development grant, and this has allowed us to use about $9.9 million in federal dollars to start to build this measurement system. You might say, Jenna, how in the world are you going to build a uniform quality measurement and improvement system that includes 10,000 classrooms across public and private partners? And so we've been able to get a head start on that this year using this grant. We've built relationships across 27 jurisdictions. We've registered sites and teachers. We're figuring out through a new link, a new data portal, how you get into a family day home in a childcare setting, get them to enter data and kind of come on the grid. We've collected responses from thousands of teachers. We've worked with superintendents, with childcare directors, with our Head Start partners on looking at how families apply and enroll for preschool. And again, we've been distributing resources to teachers, to educators, to kind of encourage, to sort of discourage retention, and encourage retention and discourage turnover. So we feel like in the progress we've made in the last 10 months, knock on wood, that we get another round of this preschool development grant, and we can use these federal dollars to kind of cover the lion's share of the cost of building this uniform measurement improvement system. So it wouldn't be a cost to the department, wouldn't be a cost to the state, with, again, a real focus here on looking at access, looking at quality, measuring, and supporting improvement. And with your VPI programs already being ahead of the game in terms of getting those measures and beginning to do that work. What to expect in the next year, and then I'll open it up for questions. So we met this morning with the First Lady and the Governor's Policy Office, presented to a set of stakeholders about what we sort of will likely see in the next month or so in terms of legislation, somewhat similar to what Mr. Gecker described last year of calling for building a uniform measurement system, moving this to the Board of Education and the Department of Education, and as well as appropriations ask around new resources for at-risk 3s and 4s. We will also hopefully get this federal grant or be able to use other federal dollars to build out this local infrastructure to support the superintendents and the teams at the school division, to support the Head Start directors, to support the private childcare and family day homes, sort of to bring them on, to provide them with the training. Ms. Holton asked this morning, how do you bring a bunch of private providers into the fold? And reality takes a little bit of time, money, and relationships, and that federal grant enables us to do that over the next 3-year period if we're able to get that. Last but not least, and I should note this, and we saw it this morning in terms of the RAIA providers. Dr. Lane and I saw it this summer with our listening sessions. One of the things that's at the top of my list of job responsibilities is engagement of stakeholders. And so one of the things that makes this work hard is that it's not just the superintendents, it's not just the principals, right? It's the private directors, it's the folks who run the family day homes, it's the big corporations, it's the churches that run the small centers. It's sort of it's in the urban areas, it's in the rural areas. And we've done a lot of engagement and would continue to sort of take on the responsibility for the lion's share of that engagement, meeting with people, meeting with the associations, helping understand, well, this seems like a lot of change for us. How do we help them make sense of that? I say that to you all as, again, having done this in another state and, speaking to kind of the board members about the impact. In this case, it was the Louisiana Board of Elementary and Secondary Education, colloquially known as BESE, and really thinking about how do we support board members who initially, in this case, were elected or appointed by the governor to focus on K-12. How do you expand to birth to 5? And a lot of it was having the department play an outsized role in terms of engagement, using its advisory committees and councils to kind of really engage people. So if we spent 7 or 8 hours talking about licensing regulations, by the time it got to the board, most of those issues had been generally resolved. And so, as well as me working with Emily and Zach and the others to kind of continue to engage you all, okay, what does it mean to kind of think about the care and education of infants and toddlers? But a lot of that will come from the Division of School Readiness and its sort of outsized engagement effort that I've been leading for the last 1.5 years and would expect would need to continue to do so going forward. So I know that's a lot of information. Hopefully, for those who heard this morning, it wasn't all sort of retread, but I would love to open it up and see what questions folks have.
Well, first of all, this is very, very exciting, and so thank you for that, and was there this morning as well. The one area that I have questions on and maybe some comments is really on slide 9 as it relates to access. And you did comment in your a few moments ago that Northern Virginia often has VPI slots not used. So just want to comment on that and then follow up with a question. The concern that we see in Northern Virginia, by and large, is really that VPI, the per pupil amount that's allotted to us, does not match what the actual cost is. In Northern Virginia, it's $14,000 to $19,500 a student on average. So being able to match that, certainly you mentioned the facilities is one, but also the ability to match that when the amount we receive is not even comparable to even half of that. So one, in a moment, just your comments on that. Is there any flexibility being thought of in terms of how we might increase that, particularly maybe for localities like Northern Virginia where the cost is different? And then also the excitement about, I heard you talk about partnership with family childcare centers, providers. I'm assuming that would be part of also flexibility change there. And then the last part in my comment is really the concern that we see in Northern Virginia also is the program eligibility is right now at a federal poverty rate that is not really matched what it really means to live in Northern Virginia. So we're just wondering if you thought about, or if it's in here anyway, potential waiver or ability for localities to have their program eligibility at the 300% federal poverty, which we've seen in other places. And for us, that's really, really important. We looked at the data, and on average, it's about $20,000 a year just to rent a 2-bedroom apartment. As I mentioned, the cost for 3 and 4-year-olds, $14,000 to $19,000. That's 3 and 4-year-old. Infant and toddler, it's $17,000 to $23,000 on average in Northern Virginia. So you just put that upon the fact, and as you indicated, you cannot finance that.
No.
So when your housing is already $20,000, considering that at 300%, that's $75,000. That's like $20,000 of your $75,000. That's for a family of 4 is already going just towards that. And so it's not tenable in our area in particular to have the program eligibility be as low as it is. So those are my comments and questions.
No, those are great questions. So yes, on the rate. So we look at, part of why we're ranked 33rd nationally is when you look at what the state actually pays, it's on average about $3,800. And then the sort of the state, the local match plus the state contribution puts you about $6,300, right? Which to your point, Dr. Duran, is, less than half of what it actually costs. One of the things that we're struck by is the history of EPI has been setting an amount, kind of based on an approximate per child, but that's not actually benchmarked to actual costs, right? And so we've done some informal work in that way. We've surveyed VPI coordinators. We did some of this work after VPI Plus. One of the things that we are recommending to the governor is, sort of some kind of increase this year, but it would be better just to kind of more formally do that type of benchmarking to actually understand what the costs are, and think about how you sort of have a phased in plan to get to closer to those costs. We do think in some places, and because the other point where, if you think about your second question in private providers, you turn around. So if that's the cost, right, and in some ways the school systems with economies of scale sometimes have the best cost. You turn around to a private provider in Northern Virginia, like, hey, I'll give you $3,800 to sort of serve a kid. They will be like, that's crazy. Like, it just, that, you're giving me $3,800 for me to have to spend $10,000. How is that, a good deal for me? And so that's partly, part of the challenge where you might have for, cultural reasons, for linguistic reasons, for facility reasons, want a partner, but right now, like, you'd have to pay more to kind of get them to offer a slot. And so we recommended to the governor some kind of differential that would kind of, for the private settings where that would sort of address some of those costs. And then on the eligibility, would love to work more with you on that. There is flexibility right now in the program guidelines. And what we found, though, is that folks aren't necessarily using that. So if we say you can do up to 15% of your kids can be locally defined criteria across the state, less than 5% of kids are eligible for locally defined criteria. So I'd love to kind of follow up with you on sort of, is there an interpretation question? Because I think we want to sort of continue to have some of this be locally defined for what you described in terms of the local context. And we want to make sure that people are maximizing that kind of policy as is.
Thank you. I appreciate that. Because as we think about equity statewide within Northern Virginia, there's inequities within our own county. And we have we did our numbers recently. The Fairfax County did some numbers to show that under 300%, we don't serve 17,500 students who would be considered eligible.
Wow.
So that's a lot of students.
Yeah, that is.
Now that's 0 to 5. So,
Yep.
and that's assuming that everyone would want to be in a program because some may want to stay home at an infant toddler. But to your point, 2/3 of families are working. So
No.
it's not that they work.
No, it is.
But
really
that's
true.
just pure numbers. So that's almost 18,000 students just in Fairfax County alone
I know.
that are not being served that could be eligible. So
Absolutely.
sometimes when we think about Northern Virginia and the resources they have, that may be true, but it's not true for all Northern Virginians. And we have many of our residents in our county that don't have the ability to pay $20,000 a year for a 2-bedroom apartment.
10,000 a
this-
year for 15,000 a year for
And
childcare.
so the numbers are stark
No,
for us, and we
absolutely.
see it as an inequity within our own county. So I appreciate the approach to equity and look forward to working with you
All
further
right.
on that.
Thank you.
Dr. Wilson.
Dr. Wilson?
Thank you. Thanks for the presentation and the update. I'm curious to know a little bit more about the incremental increase that you're suggesting, not only from the number of students served, but how does that translate in terms of coverage across the Commonwealth? We have 10 pilot sites right now, or in the original PDG. But how does that translate to expanding across the Commonwealth? And then from a budget perspective, I notice here the recommendation being to over time grow this. What's the out year that you're anticipating or suggesting? We'll start there with those.
Sure. Yeah. So sort of two areas you're thinking about this in increments. So in terms of getting to a place where you'd be able to measure every classroom and have every publicly funded program kind of connected to the grid, we think we can do that by within a 3-year period. And so we basically we have our first set of communities. We'd bring on another set next year. You'd bring on a third set in the following year in 2021. And then you'd either be there or you'd bring on in 2022 everybody else. And you kind of get these observations done. We've mapped out that and kind of in sort of through the 3-year preschool development grant. At the same time, they're measuring every classroom. They're building these relationships and kind of connecting the public and private partners. They're also looking at access and enrollment, and they are connecting each of these programs to Link B5, right? Which is, again, sort of essential. Like if you don't have a way, some kind of electronic system, a data portal in this case, to connect, okay, where are my infant and toddler classrooms? What site are they affiliated with? What do we know about those classrooms? What kids are being served there? What quality elements are there? And that doesn't exist, right? Although we have a lot of DOE systems where we know all of our elementary schools, all of they have site numbers and that. It's kind of Wild West. In fact, when you want to apply for a license right now, childcare license in the state, you do it on paper, right? So we've really got to kind of build that technology so that we'd be able to say, okay, this kid is served here at this setting. We then can kind of connect that data, give that data to families to inform their choice, and then kind of connect that kid to the kindergarten readiness results and so on. So that is part of that. What's great about this federal grant, knock on wood if we get it, is that would also help us build that data portal, connect it to the DOE systems, connect it to the longitudinal data system is kind of what we propose to do that. So that's reasonable to get there. One of the things I learned doing this in Louisiana in terms of bringing every last community on board is it's helpful to have a requirement in law in terms of like, to sort of, even if it's a year or two out, right? But sort of saying to folks, there's a choice. If you want to take public dollars to serve vulnerable kids, we're going to help you. We're going to pay for the training. We're going to bring you into the fold, but we really do need you to participate. From an equity perspective, having done this in a state where we went from a voluntary rating system to a as I call it, a non-voluntary system, it has an equity implication. Like when you look at who are the last folks to bring on, and it has more to do with folks just being busy, being overwhelmed, right? Folks who sort of stood up and said, I'll offer childcare in this community because my mom's desperately needed. But there were some of the lowest quality scores. And rolling out that system, getting that kind of apples to apples comparison. It's not the childcare centers who kind of come to the meetings, right? It's not the childcare centers who have the resources, but we were able to kind of uncover where those pockets of sort of deeply concerning practices for kids were happening, sort of SWAT team in resources. And over the last 3 years in Louisiana, they've really improved those places. And a part of it was just about bringing the resources to you, right? If you're running a mom and pop childcare center way off the grid, you're just not, you just may not be aware that they're out there. So that's how we approach that piece. when we thought about increasing the number of threes, I think we'd like to get to a place where no matter where you went, if you were an economically disadvantaged 3 and 4-year-old or 3 and 4-year-old with special needs, you'd be able to kind of just get into high quality preschool, right? But we thought it would be too fast to just sort of throw 3-year-olds into the VPI formula next year. It would just be too much. Folks would be building buildings. We're not. And so we're going to propose to the governor kind of, a set of resources in each of those buckets. So kind of a way in which you have VPI and you'd like to serve 3-year-olds, you could apply to us to do that. We would set a certain number of classes we'd offer. We would look at how that went. We'd say you'd have to work with partners so that if your Head Start is serving all your 3-year-olds, like how would you sort of backfill from there, not kind of take their 3-year-olds, right, but work together. And similarly with mixed delivery, where if your community wanted to apply and I've got a handful of private centers that are ready to go, and offering kind of 3 and 4-year-olds, you'd be able to do that. I could imagine a couple thousand kids in that. I think you do that in this biennial budget. You make progress in those 2 years, and you can come back in 2 years and say, okay, let's make a decision on whether we really want to add 3-year-olds to the formula. Ms. Atkinson?
I have to be honest, it's a little overwhelming. I'm trying to get my mind around, right now as a state board, we deal with our local school divisions.
Mm-hmm.
And so the mixed delivery system is sort of a new animal. How, who do they come under? How do we respond to that? But another thing, as you provided this presentation, you're using the term teacher and educator, and I think you're using them interchangeably. And for us, a teacher is a licensed individual. So I'm having a hard time sort of working my way through what you intend to do based on that kind of language. And so it would be helpful to sort of make some distinctions if we need to do that now and then it changes. But I'm one of these people that want to try to analyze it, and I'm having a hard time doing that. On the VPI and increasing that to at-risk 3-year-olds, are you talking about this same VPI program we currently have in place, or are you're talking about some changes to that program in order to do this? Do you have thoughts, or can you articulate a little clearer what those types of changes might be? VPI, as you said, it for Virginia, it's been very successful, and it has very clear components to it, and which, based on the research which it was based on, has led to that success. So I want to understand whether we're going to change that, how we might be changing that, and whether there's research behind those types of changes.
Absolutely. So I think on the teacher one is a deeper one, right? As you're sort of looking at kind of where the field currently is, right, and sort of where the kids are being served. And I think, as a practice, I do use teacher or educator, whether you're sort of state licensed or not. And that, I think, is increasingly what you find if you go into these private settings. And so I kind of, out of deep respect for that, I do think it is something that we'll grapple with. And you sort of think about how you do it. It would not make sense based on the current workforce, the volume of classrooms, to say we're going to, in any short order, require, a license to teach in childcare. Right now, when we look at the survey results, about a third of our teachers in childcare have bachelor's degree or master's degree, but over 50% only have a high school degree, right? So there's a huge gulf between those two. One of the things that we would likely do through this uniform measurement system, and what we found in Louisiana, was that you could actually measure teacher-child interactions. And on average, our teachers with bachelor's degree who are licensed will outperform others, but not all the time. And when we observed half of the VPI classrooms this spring, so about 500 classrooms, 600 classrooms, and you had some who scored best in the country, and then you had some who would have scored lower probably than their childcare teacher down the street. And so I think it's we would like to professionalize this workforce. We would not reduce the requirement for VPI in the schools. I think it's in statute in terms of teachers have to be licensed and have a bachelor's degree. 99.9% of our VPI teachers do, and so we would sort of hold fast there. And then we would need to grapple with, do you need a kind of a minimum credential, in childcare teaching? In Louisiana, after they had begun to do this measurement at scale, the board then made a decision, here's the credential we want to do. And it was an ancillary certificate. So it was different from their kind of traditional teaching certificate. They defined it. They worked with higher ed and community colleges to kind of figure out the precise requirements. They had a 5-year window or sort of 5-year runway for folks to get up to it. And then they sort of supported the workforce. But it was a different credential for all of the reasons I talked about before. And so I think that's something that we would need to grapple with, because you want to balance between professionalizing the workforce, but also what the supply is. But you wouldn't back off or make any changes in terms of the VPI teacher requirement in schools. As it relates to your great question about VPI in threes, a lot of the tools and the practice you could do in a 3-year-old only classroom, you could do in a mixed 3 and 4-year-old classroom, or you could do in a 4-year-old classroom. So again, requirement for the teacher would remain the same. The vast majority of quality curriculum are already preschool curriculum, so kind of 3 and 4-year-old materials, so you could use it interchangeably. The ratios in terms of the national gold standard ratios, roughly we would already be at that expectation. I think we'd want to be thoughtful. Obviously, there's some 3-year-olds that are like 4-year-olds, and there's some 3-year-olds that you're like, whoa, this is a whole new universe, and that's why we also propose going smaller. I would imagine in some of our communities, they're going to want to be mixed age classrooms. So part of why VPI is expensive is those teacher-child ratios. So if you're not able to fill a classroom, it doesn't pay for itself. So for instance, if you only have 9 kids, you can't even pay for the lead teacher. And so wanting to provide some flexibility, measuring that and doing it, but it would, whether it was and this is what kind of already works with early childhood special education, your VPI classroom would probably look generally the same, whether it was 3s and 4s or just 4s. They'd have those same quality requirements. We'd measure those classrooms in the same way. Where the difference lies and where we see the real returns for kids is if with your top teachers who are individualizing kind of the instruction, they're sort of developing the strong relationships. We might end up looping where the teacher has the child for 2 years, develop a very strong relationship. In the community helper unit in year 1, they might focus more on one thing. And then in year 2 on the more advanced content in the curriculum. So it is one of those rare age bands where there's not a dramatic difference. In contrast, if you were looking at 2s and 3s, then you're talking about different curriculum, vastly different development, but developmentally, that 36-month to 60-month is a little bit more flexible. And so you could have mixed age classrooms, but you'd have, for the most part, the same quality requirements. So we wouldn't be going backwards any way, shape, or form there. Great questions.
Okay, I guess.
And I should have noted this too. It's a lot. I mean, I'm one of the few people probably in the country who thinks about all of these things all of the time. And I realize that it is overwhelming. I know that, we talked a little bit about this earlier, and again, part of what we've tried to do through the preschool development is build up our staff here at the department, right? So that we're kind of building this capacity. We're not taking on something that we're not prepared to support. We understand the importance of engaging the broad set of stakeholders. I realize it's a lot for you. I do think at any point in time, if folks wanted to talk to some of the Louisiana board members, I'd be more than willing to kind of broker a conversation on what it was like, to sort of have this occur over a multi-year period. I think, they don't have, I think they would be really struck by the kind of equity focus and would be like, oh, aha, that makes a lot of sense. That was in Louisiana, it was a response to a state mandate. I feel like what's exciting about Virginia is it actually comes from the why rather than the what. In contrast, this was a mandate that kind of fell onto the board in Louisiana, but I would certainly kind of helping to understand how we can better support you through this transition would be, open to that, because I want to recognize it's a lot. It's a lot of information.
One final comment,
Yeah.
maybe, and something to put on the list is thinking about the timeline, as I mentioned before, about, this movement to one board, one agency. What does that horizon look like? And then what are the downstream implications as this becomes one department or one board, one agency, and how this pre-K world dovetails nicely into K-12 and implications perhaps for our school divisions and what that looks like and all of it, which is kind of down the road, but I don't want to lose sight of that, especially over the work we've been doing around equity, around our SOQ conversation and all of those. How do these pieces tag into that? So for another time, but something that I'm really interested in hearing more about.
Absolutely.
I just go ahead, Ann. I thought.
Two things. First, just thank you. I mean, this is amazing. I'm with Diane. It is a little overwhelming, but frankly, the fact that you've done this before and have partnered with a state that's done something similar before really gives us all confidence. And I would just encourage you. You said something this morning about trying not to talk about another state. I think it's great to talk about. I mean, frankly, just somebody has actually moved the needle in a similar way. Therefore, it's possible. And that's one of the messages we all need to hear, is that this isn't a pipe dream. It's somebody else has done it. So it's we always love to be first on the one hand, and on the other hand, it's intimidating to be first. So and then the one, I don't know, this isn't so much a question, but just a caution as you help us step into our role on it. Our licensing structure process here is, has room to grow in terms of what we're doing already on licensing. It's a relatively informal process and setup compared to, say, the health professions licensing setup, et cetera. And, for historical reasons, it is what it is. But when you give us a whole lot more licensing obligation, we will be overwhelmed by that without a whole lot of, we'll need real structural changes to get us to where you'll need us to be. And I see that that's one of those a little bit on the more distant horizon recommendations.
Absolutely. That's a great point. Well, I appreciate that. I should note that last Wednesday, Louisiana, they roll out, similar to what you all do with school quality profiles, they roll it out. It's birth to 12th grade. They rolled out their third year of the early childhood profiles in addition to the K-12 profiles. Third year in a row in which there was across the board improvement. Third year in a row in which childcare, Head Start, and their pre-K classrooms improved on the class measure of interactions. And so I think what's really exciting is not only were we able to move the pieces in Louisiana, but I think the way in which we're proposing to build this more uniform measurement improvement system truly is an improvement system. It was originally intended to be more of an accountability play, as you might imagine, and which was much more politically palatable in 2012. But what ended up happening by measuring in the same way, by supporting all of the sectors, by, I think, being thoughtful about handling things like teacher licensing, you really laid out a pathway for individual programs, for big school divisions to improve. And I'd be more than willing to share those results. So that's the last piece I'll leave with you. I mean, I think, part of it is I certainly bring some skills to this in terms of having done this before, but if there's any one thing I would point to in Louisiana, it's the fact that that's still going on, and I left a year and a half ago. And so every part of me is serious about doing this well, but doing it in a way that can outlast any particular governor, board, or chief school readiness officer. And so that's what's so exciting about what's happening in Louisiana, and which I hope to be a part of bringing to Virginia.
Ms. Atkinson.
Just one other question related to the care side of the world. Years ago, this agency used to have responsibility for childcare provided in the public schools. I know that moved over to social services. So I know those regs are really primarily focused on the health component versus the education component. As you talk about the fact that we want to create, education throughout that system, do you anticipate that at some point those regulations that govern the licensing will begin to have a component that we would see more as education, not just health.
So I certainly think you can't separate those at the classroom level, right? And so when I go out and talk to childcare providers and they say, it's not like when I'm interacting with this 2-year-old, well, now I'm doing health and safety and then I'm turning over to kind of care and education, right? And so when on those slides where I think about sort of health, safety, and quality, I do think about those as one and the same. I also think if you're going to have licensing inspectors going into all the classrooms, then being really thoughtful about, how to sort of use that most efficiently. I don't think you want licensing inspectors doing kind of teacher-child quality interactions, right? But you do want them checking on some of those other things so that, you can kind of use a really smart auditing system on like the use of curriculum, some of those other pieces. So I do think we'll tackle those. We moved licensing, the sort of the child care center, not the teacher licensing, over in Louisiana. We kind of looked at top to bottom. We didn't sort of make any changes as it related to the school classrooms, but we did sort of really try to say, with the data we know today, how do we keep kids healthy and safe, but also kind of think about that balance with quality, right? Because kids need all three and teachers are charged with all three. And I think that would be something we'd really kind of want to look at. I also think it's an opportunity in terms of the culture. And I would say this is something they're trying to do right now in social services, and we would continue if it moved over. But how do you partner with programs to kind of really support kids' learning and development? Health and safety is obviously essential, right? But I think that there's that world has evolved, and sometimes our regulatory apparatuses haven't evolved as much. And so that was a big thing as we really streamline the health and safety regulations and align them with quality in Louisiana. And we'd want to do the same, Ms. Atkinson.
Okay.
I just wanted to clarify that what I said about licensing before, I'm really referring to our board role in licensing appeals.
Yes,
Not
teacher. Yep.
not the-
There's two different types of
The
licensing. Yep.
department's routine licensing processes.
no.
I didn't mean to be.
No. I knew
Something
what you're
like
talking about.
So since we let Ms. Holton ask one more thing, that's okay. I'm going to ask just two quick things. I was going to kill this, but I'm not going to now. So thank you for the permission, Ann. And very technically, I guess, you use the phrase at risk at different times and sometimes socioeconomic disadvantaged. Are you using those interchangeably?
When we reflected the overall numbers, when we defined at risk, we look at economically disadvantaged and kids with special needs. So both being kind of a target for those 3 and 4-year-olds.
Okay, and I thought I heard you say something like we're going to target basically the at-risk population first. But if you look at your data, if you have 100,000 kids, 45,000 of those are, from a population that will not be ready for school, but will not be from what you classify as an at-risk population.
Yeah, so I think that
what are we going to do
with everybody else?
I guess because I know there's a gap there, and you pointed that out. But if you do all your numbers, there's a 10-point gap basically between the non-socio and the socioeconomically disadvantaged in terms of kindergarten readiness based, I think, on what you've got here, if I did the math right.
Yep. So I describe that in two ways. I think, one is there's a broader effort around helping families understand what school readiness is, kind of promoting that. I think that with having the Virginia Kindergarten Readiness Program, we were just meeting with PBS a week or two ago to sort of really promote that, getting more parents talking about self-regulation and social skills, how we can support that, website, apps, tools, all of those in partnership with kind of Smart Beginnings and communities is one piece of it. One of the things that's unique about this quality measurement improvement system is that it measures classrooms, not kids, right? And so when you think about how the subsidy program works, oftentimes you have a large number of programs of which only a handful of are subsidy kids. And what we would propose to do with our measurement improvement system is even if a center takes one publicly funded kid, you actually observe all of those classrooms. So when I talked about the Louisiana classrooms improving, those were classrooms that are improving not only for the 17,000 publicly subsidized kids, but all of the kids, right? Including my kids who are not publicly subsidized, but who attended in Louisiana and now in Virginia childcare centers that take public funds. And so it ends up having, it's kind of, you get more bang for your buck in terms of, more than just the subsidy kids, right? Because there's only about 20,000 kids on subsidy, more of those kind of folks who are just above, as Dr. Duran talked, there's eligibility cuts, but you start to get, and you create a set of incentives, Mr. Gecker, and you track how many, so you get to a pretty critical mass of here's how many infant, toddler, 3 and 4 classrooms. So the number of classrooms often far exceeds the reach just of the publicly funded kids. So that helps tackle that other aspect in terms of making sure that even if you're not publicly funded, that if you attend a child care center in the Commonwealth, that it's a high quality one.
Okay. One last question. You mentioned going into this that we may have the narrative all wrong. I think I've got this quoted correctly, that the largest gap may in fact be on the first day of kindergarten and everything else is doing fine.
Well, yes.
I will tell you that.
Or playing catch up. And this was the Elliot's point.
That runs a little contrary to, I think, some of the things we take as a basic assumption in some of the school divisions, which is that the gap is widening over time as some of the instructional hours are not well used, or, in fact, if you look at a lot of the research that we did on the equity to create, the new SOQs, it would not contradict that, but it would have an underlying philosophy that's a little bit different than that. I mean, how sure are you that you're right about that statement?
Well, I think the fundamental challenge is that the greatest point in whether it's early childhood or in K-12 accountability systems is that the greatest point of variability is at the classroom, right? And so,
Exactly.
right, I mean, so the kind of the sort of huge challenge in front of us is how do you, regardless of what division or school or site a kids attend, how do you make sure that our kids who are sort of furthest from opportunity have year over year classroom experiences that move them? I do think, that if we can get that right in early childhood, where kids, where there's so much rapid brain development, where so much of the foundational skills are built, that makes it easier for us to get it right with K-12 and potentially, kind of close those gaps or prevent those gaps from occurring. So, it's probably not an either or in terms of, one system's working or one's not. But I think we should be obsessed from kind of early ages, really through that 3rd grade cutoff, and then, through the high school and beyond, on giving our kids, our most vulnerable kids, a set of experiences that move them. Right.
I mean, I obviously have no disagreement with the idea that every child ought to have the same opportunity, starting at birth and moving on. I guess, I thought had seen some work that suggested that even with Head Start, for example, the boost from Head Start begins to separate again out by grade 3, and which would indicate that there is some need for us still to continue the work in the K-12.
Well, and I'm also
keep the
sort of
standards
recently obsessed with K2 too. So, I mean, in terms of that, but the Head Start fade out survey, I think, again, is as they look in more detail, they're finding some of the academic pieces fade out. There's a question on how much of that is, are we taking kids who are doing better at K and not focusing as much, right? So, but certainly some of the things that they're finding with Head Start and some of the other preschool pieces, that there's really almost no fade out on the self-regulation, the social skills, those core pieces. So, while we might see some movement up and down on some of the other pieces, an investment in our young kids, knowing that these core foundational skills are built, I really think we'll find will pay off.
Okay, well, I'd like to thank you for,
Thank you.
on behalf of the board, for taking the time to be with us. Certainly, as Diane said, somewhat overwhelming in different places, but certainly necessary that we begin to understand, what's coming, and hopefully participate in the process to the extent that we can, making this happen.
Absolutely.
So thank you very much.
Wonderful. Thank you all for all your time this afternoon.
Okay. Next up is a discussion on potential guidance to fulfill the instructional hours requirement utilizing virtual learning opportunities. Dr. Magnic-Mont.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
President Gecker, can I say I was just shocked that you did not aspire to have the title of Director of STEM and Innovation. Like, I just don't even know what to think of that.
Some dreams got killed early on in my life. don't even reference it anymore.
In all seriousness, let me go ahead and provide you a little bit of context of why I'm here today. So the Department of Learning and Innovation has gotten multiple inquiries within the past year about the 990 hours, 180-day rule that currently exists. I think as our school divisions are starting to really think creatively about how they're going to provide those deeper learning experiences for students, this issue arises more and more. So I think when you're talking about this rule, the overarching question that exists is, do students really need to be in a seat in the school building to learn and acquire knowledge, right? Should the school building really be the place where they take that content knowledge that's acquired and apply it in real world, authentic ways? So a perfect example would be like, if I asked you right now, how does natural selection happen? You may or may not remember high school biology, but you're all pretty smart people and you can go on Google and you can look at different videos and you could explain that to me. But if a teacher were to sit there and ask students an authentic problem, was how does this affect people who overprescribe medication like antibiotics? Well, how does that align with natural selection? So really getting our kids to think more deeply and apply the content in meaningful ways. So many of our school divisions are rethinking this right now. They're rethinking this time-based system that currently exists, and they're focusing on that more personalized student-centered learning where mastery should be the core focus. The idea of giving our students more control over their learning, over the time that they learn, the place that they learn, the path in which they learn, and of course, the pace of their own learning. School divisions want to think creatively and leverage the technology that currently exists in order to incorporate different learning models. An example being virtual learning, online learning, and of course the blended learning space. And then thinking about how we could adjust that school schedule to provide more flexibility for these types of learning models that are currently prevalent in other areas across the nation. So I think as we move to these personalized competency-based models to support our students and allow them to dig more deeply into the content in a more transdisciplinary way, our leaders and our teachers are concerned for the lack of time that they have for planning, to plan for deeper learning experiences, and the time to work together in teams to focus on that interdisciplinary approach. And then, of course, how do principals and other educational leaders provide the time needed for professional learning in order to get to deeper learning when you really only have 8 to 10 days in a school year in order to provide training? So currently, the models that we're proposing, did I skip a slide? No, I didn't. Okay, yeah, here I am. So models to resolve the concern include, but they're not limited to, so these are some of the ideas coming out of our school divisions. To allow our students to work occasionally from home in order to utilize division laptops, learning management systems, and teacher content. And then the day that they're free becomes a teacher work day where they can then work in collaboration with each other, work within professional learning communities, undergo professional learning, and of course have time for planning. Other models include flexing that school day so you can then come to school late or leave early to provide that needed planning time as well. So potential barriers that get in the way of this type of flexibility is our standards of accreditation. Currently, there are definitions of instructional school day, instructional hours, our standard school day, and standard school year. And then, of course, are the Code of Virginia, which defines the 990-hour, 180-day restriction. So We also have to be considerate as well as we look at the 990 hours and 180 days and think of if we just say, go ahead, be creative and do what you want, what are those unintended consequences that could exist? So thinking about what assurances can be developed in lieu of time. How do we think of equity and access? Do students have access to one-to-one technology at home? Do they have internet access at home that they might not have, or they have in school but might not have at home? What about services and meals that we provide, or the student support time that they're given when they're in the school day? And then, of course, how are they going to have access to teachers during the school day if they're involved in professional learning communities, or they're planning and collaborating with teachers and a student has a question? Another thing that we have to be considerate of is childcare arrangements. Even if we're talking about middle school, there are certain parents that don't want their students home alone. So we've come to think that maybe a possible solution to this code that is restricting or providing this time-based restriction would be to provide guidance. So we could establish a work group of stakeholders across the Commonwealth where we consider virtual and blended learning and how that can support deeper learning with consideration to equity and access. And then, of course, to maybe rethink current definitions and language surrounding the standard school day or year. So while this wouldn't change the code, I think the solutions can provide our divisions a structure when trying to innovate within their schools. So we brought this to all of you today to consider how we might be able to support them and move away from this time-based constraint that currently exists and provide our students with more of a flexibility in how and when they want to learn. Any questions?
Not a question, but a comment.
Please.
I'm full of comments today. Thank you for the presentation and the kind of framing the question. I'll encourage us to think about whether it's a work group or the department, but to really be clear and consistent with the problem we're trying to solve. So in the presentation, in a couple of places, it sounds like this is a problem that we're trying to help, trying to focus for our students in terms of their deeper learning. But in other places, it sounds like the resolution or the possible solutions are really focused on the teacher or the adults.
Right.
So I think we need to be really clear about what is the primary problem we're trying to solve, and then what are the pieces that go along with that to solve that primary problem. There may be secondary issues, but let's just be really clear about what's the issue really that we're trying. And I'm not quite clear which one is leading, is my observation.
Okay.
So I hear the 990 clock hours, right? And where do students learn? But in some of the slides, it feels like the resolutions are all about the teacher side of things and not necessarily about the student side of things. So that's just an observation.
Okay.
Thank you, though.
You're welcome.
And I'll look forward to more information and more conversation.
Ms. Atkinson.
I haven't really looked at the set of regs, but we have a set of regs that deal with virtual schools. Does it make sense at some point to really look into those and see how they may have addressed some of the issues that you raise here? And then the other aspect of it, the chronic absenteeism. I know I don't think you mentioned it, but it's in the slides. But because that is a component of our accountability system, I think that really needs to be addressed. I was looking at one of the codes, our administrative codes, our regs related to standard school year and school day. And there is a mechanism in there related to not having a full day schedule and having a waiver based on local policies. And so I think that's something else that if we're going to be looking at this, we probably need to be looking at that as well.
Can I provide some clarity? Currently in the virtual learning regs, there's nothing that refers to this piece of legislation or this code, right? It doesn't really address it. But there's nothing within the code that speaks to the fact that online learning can't be used. Does that make sense? To fulfill the 990 clock hours in 180 days. It's kind of ambiguous, which is why we were coming to you today with the idea of maybe providing guidance to our school divisions that help them think through this possible solution. And there is a waiver that they can ask for. But I think what's happening is there's so many school divisions coming to us. Do they need 132 waivers for this? Or can we just be kind of proactive and provide the guidance and clarity to them to help them work through this?
By mentioning the other set of regulations was not thinking that it had an answer. It was really, as you raise some issues of equity, how are those issues addressed in that set of regulations? Because I imagine I would hope as we develop those that we address some of those issues in that set of regulations, not that it was going to address seat time or clock hours, et cetera.
Ms. Holton.
So thank you for helping inform us on this. And I think the idea of doing a work group makes a lot of sense. I will just say, and maybe this is somewhat following up on Dr. Wilson's comments, but that some of the examples you've given here, I'm like, well, we want people to be creative, but I will say, I'm not sure I imagined that being part of what we were encouraging here. And in particular, one of the things I'd encourage your work group to think about, I mean, we do look to our communities look to our K-12 schools not just to do education function. It is a custodial function, whether we like that fact or not. And so we certainly need to at least think about the implications if we're saying, well, we can do the education, we can meet the educational function without being in a custodial relationship with these children. Okay, well, in a virtual school setting where a parent has opted for that for their child, that's a different question. But where a parent may not have signed up for that and they thought the school was providing physical oversight to their child, and then now all of a sudden you're not. So yes, we want our students out of the classroom doing experiential learning in interesting ways, but I do think it's helpful for the work group to think about how do we meet our obligations to keep the children safe and appropriately supervised when they're in a less contained setting. And maybe some of it's a matter of putting parents on notice about what's happening so that we, to the extent necessary, shift that responsibility back. But liability, custodial responsibility is worth having. And again, we don't want fears of liability to constrain people's creativity, but it's raising some red flags for me.
I agree.
And not with respect to going forward as a work group, but with where the work group might go.
Anybody else? Thank you very much.
Thank you, guys.
Okay. Briefing on standard setting procedures. Ms. Loving Ryder.
Good afternoon, President Gecker, members of the board, and Dr. Lane. I do not have a PowerPoint, but you should have a document in front of you with the scintillating title of Standard Setting, Description of Angoff Procedure.
I will say this will be the lead topic at the next party on that.
Yes, I'm certain that it will. As you all are aware, you adopted new English standards of learning in 2017. And as is our current practice, we will administer new reading tests that measure those standards this spring in 2020. And it is your responsibility as a board when we administer new tests to determine what the achievement level is necessary for proficient and advanced. We will bring those recommendations to you at the January board meeting for first review. And then because you have no February meeting, you will see those recommendations on final review in March. But in preparation for that discussion today, I just wanted to talk with you briefly about the process that we use and the information that we'll provide you in January. So I'm always mindful of Mr. Gacker's concern about jargon. So I will try to explain the terminology as we go through.
She means it's even so I can understand it.
No. So standard setting really is, it's a systematic way of making a professional judgment on the level of achievement that really is necessary for a student's performance to be classified in a particular performance level. And this is all in your document. So for grades 3 through 8 reading, we have 4 performance levels: below basic, basic, proficient, and advanced. And for the end of course reading test, we have only 3: fail, proficient, and advanced. And so the idea behind the adoption of the achievement for those various performance levels is to have a description of what that means. So the standard setting procedure that we have used for quite some time is called the Angoff procedure. We've actually used this since the first standard setting in 1998. And I think one of the strengths of the Standards of Learning program in general is its reliance on educators. Our educators review our standards of learning, make recommendations. They review every item that goes on a standards of learning test before it is administered. And following that same pattern, we rely heavily on their expertise to determine what the performance levels should be to pass the tests. This board in 1998, through a resolution, made it very clear that it was your intent to rely on the expertise of educators primarily in determining what passing would be on the various tests. And to this point, you have continued to rely primarily on their recommendations. So I'm going to talk with you now a little bit about what that looks like. And so this is about the middle of the first page, and it says that panelists receive training in the standard setting procedure. And the panelists really are the committees of educators. We have about 12 to 15 educators for each test. They come from across the Commonwealth. We do our best to ensure that we are representing the Commonwealth to the extent that we can. Of course, we are restricted by who applies to be on the committee. We do get our nominees through superintendent's memo, and the superintendent must sign off on nominees from particular school divisions. So they do receive training, and then the next step is they review what's called the performance level descriptors. And I gave you an example there of what it means to be proficient in grade 3 reading. These performance level descriptors are initially drafted by department staff based on the expectation in the standards of learning, but they are vetted through Virginia teachers, through the committees that we have that are convened each summer. So here again, it's Virginia teachers are certainly involved in the process. So following the review of those performance level descriptors, then we ask the standard setting panelists to think really carefully about, so if you were thinking about a student who was just proficient, so just over the line from basic to proficient, what would that particular student need to know and be able to do? So the performance level descriptors describe what proficient as a category is. But if you as a teacher were thinking about a student who was just over the line to pass, what would that performance look like? And there's a lot of discussion about this. They do this activity for each performance level. So proficient, advanced, and then for grades 3 through 8, also basic. And the thought behind this is it helps everyone to get on the same page in terms of what they expect in terms of the various performance levels. So following that activity, the teachers then actually review the test items, and this is under round 1 in your document. So they examine each item on the test, and they're thinking about this just over the line proficient student and trying to decide whether or not a typical just over the line student would get that item correct or not. And they just answer yes or no. Each panelist does this independently, and then at the end of what's called round one, which is the first round of judgments, their judgments are then summarized, and that is a cut score. A cut score really is the number of items that a student must get correct to be classified in a particular performance level, and we'll just use proficient as an example. So following that round one judgment, all of the panelists for that particular test results are displayed. We don't put their names, but it's panelist 1, panelist 2, and so on. And then the members of the panelists see what the other members of the group came up with for a cut score. They talk about what that looks like. And then the panelists also have fairly extensive discussions about items where there was some disagreement. So if, there are 15 panelists and 8 said, yes, a barely proficient student should get it correct, and 7 said no, then that would be an item where the panelists would have extensive discussions about that particular item. And they would look at the content of that item against the performance level descriptors that they have derived. So there's a fairly extensive discussion, and then following that discussion, the panelists go into round 2. Same activity, they again review every item and make a judgment about whether they think a just proficient student would get that item correct or not. At the end of round 2, same process, they get summary level information about the panelist, again discuss any items where there was disagreement, and then there is round 3. On round 3, they don't look at the particular items. Instead, they're just looking at their cut score. And maybe there are 50 items and my cut score is 25. And I'm looking at it and thinking, is that an appropriate cut score? How does it compare to what I have seen my fellow panelists recommend in round 2? And then they make their final judgment. At the end of round 3, the panelists for that particular test go home. So they leave without knowing what the final judgment is. And we do that deliberately because this is a sensitive topic. And so we want to ensure that the results are confidential until they come before you. So that is the standard setting process for each individual test. So in December, when we do this for reading, we will have a different committee for grades 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 reading, and also one for end of course. After their work is completed, then we also have an articulation committee, and this is at the bottom of page 2. The articulation committee is composed of 2 to 3 representatives from each of the standard setting committees. And the purpose of this committee is to ensure that there's some rationale for the recommendations that will come forward to you. These committee members look at the performance level descriptors for each of the tests, and the representative from that grade level will talk about the discussions that the committee had. So the grade 3 representative will talk a bit about how the committee viewed proficient for grade 3 reading. And after they talk about the performance level descriptors, then the information from round 3 for each test is displayed. So the articulation committee knows what the median or the middle cut score for each of those committees was. We don't use the mean because, as you all know, means can be really skewed by people who are at opposite ends of the range. So you do use the median or the middle score. We also provide information to the articulation committee in terms of what the estimated impact would be of the cut scores. This is an estimate. So it is a statistical projection of if the board adopted this particular cut score, what would be the impact on the pass rates? How many students would fall into each proficiency level? The reason that the articulation committee is provided with this information is they also have the content knowledge. So the question they're asked is, when you look at this impact data, if you see a difference in the number of students who are proficient in grade 3 reading as compared to grade 4, can you explain that from a content perspective? And sometimes a difference can be explained. Perhaps the grade 4 members felt that the grade 4 expectations were much more rigorous. They have lots of discussions about whether or not the cut scores are reasonable in terms of the estimated impact on the pass rates, and they can make adjustments. And you will see in the chart we'll look at in a few minutes that sometimes the articulation committee does make a recommendation for a change. They may see that the grade 7 and grade 8 cut scores are very discrepant and they can't come up with the content reasons. So they might make a recommendation for a change. This committee, we also provide information to them about if we were to maintain the same level of rigor on the new test that we have on the old, what would that look like? So this committee, really its purpose is to determine whether or not the cut scores that we will bring forward to you are reasonable in terms of the content that's in those tests and the expectations for those students. The individual committees do not have that impact data, but we do feel that it's important for the articulation committee to have that information. So that is a description of the standard setting process. And then what you have on the next page is an example of the chart, which I will bring to you when we do the standard setting in January. The first one you have is actually from 2012. And I know it seems odd that I should be giving you something this old, but I wanted to use it as an example for why we now provide you with some contextual information that we did not provide before. So if you look on the left-hand side, you'll see that it's divided into pass proficient and pass advanced. And the first information we provide you is background information. And let's just look at grade 4 first. So you'll see for grade 4 math, the background information says that the pass proficient cut score for the previous math test was 31 out of 50. The next column says if we were to maintain the same level of rigor on that test as was on the previous test, what would the cut score be? And you see that it's 20. So the intent of giving you all this information was to give you a sense of the level of rigor in the new test as opposed to the old. And you'll see here that in 2012, I'm sure you all remember that the 2009 mathematics standards were much more rigorous than the previous version, and the tests were very difficult. So this contextual information was added to give the board a sense that if the standard setting committee came forward with a particular cut score and it seemed lower, you would have a sense of why that might be. As it turned out, in this particular situation, the articulation committee recommended the 31 out of 50. So I'm going to leave that chart now and go to the chart from 2019, which is the last set of cut scores you all adopted. So again, the background information, we'll just do grade 4 again. You see that the cut score in the previous test was 31 out of 50. The second column, if you were to maintain the same level of rigor on the new test as was on the old, the cut score would be 29 out of 50. So not a great deal of change in the rigor this time around. Then the next columns provide you information from the standard setting committee. So the round 3 median for proficient, that is the median of the actual standard setting committee for grade 4. And then the next column is the articulation committee's recommendation. And you'll see that they did move the cut score up quite a bit. The standard setting committee was 20 out of 50. Articulation recommended 25 out of 50. And then the last column, it's abbreviated, but it really is the superintendent's recommendation. You'll see in this case that Dr. Lane recommended moving the cut score up further to 26 out of 50. And that is the cut score you adopted. Same information is on the right-hand side for Pass Advanced. And you get the same information for end of course. I just didn't include that chart. So I thought it would be helpful for you all to have this overview ahead of time, so when you get the information in January, it won't be Greek or Latin or whatever. So hopefully this was helpful, and I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Dr. Duran.
I think I know the answer. I want to make sure.
Okay.
So the column with rigor, that's the second column.
Yes.
That I believe from the March conversation is done by department staff that are psychometricians. Is that correct?
This is done by Pearson, who is our
Pearson.
testing contractor, and you are correct. It is done by psychometricians. One thing I want to clarify about this is it is not a recommendation from Pearson. Instead, it's intended to be contextual information. So if you maintain the same level of rigor, this is what it would be.
And then the columns that come from the panel and the articulation committee are more not looking at rigor per se. They're looking more at the proficiency based on each item. In particular, the median column, they're not even looking at the impact. So they're looking at the actual performance level that they felt based on each item, irrespective of what the rigor may be or irrespective of what the impact may be. Is that
They
correct?
do not have impact information, but they, as teachers, are looking at each item and saying each individual item and thinking about the skills that are required for grade 3 reading and thinking about, so should a student in 3rd grade be able to read this passage and answer this item and get it correct to be considered proficient? So while they don't have impact data, they are thinking about rigor in terms of, is this an item that a student should be
But not
expected?
rigor in terms of it compared to the last test as a whole,
That is
per
correct.
se.
They
It's
do
more
not
on
have-
the individual.
That's correct.
Mastery of the content
They
that
do
they're
not
looking
have
for.
information about many of them probably know what the cut score was on the previous test, but that's not something we emphasize. And the thought here is we want them as experts to be thinking about the content of the item in comparison to what they expect students in that particular grade level to know and be able to do, and make a judgment about whether students should get that item correct. So it really is an item level judgment.
2 more questions, one for you and one for Dr. Lane. And do you feel confident? You said that the panel depends upon who applies. Do you feel that you have confidence, though, in the panel members that you've been getting? And have you had any concerns with that process? Because sometimes when you put it out for people just to apply, as to your point, it's, depending on who does. And has that a concern to you? Or are you confident that that process has been successful in
We have
the
had
type of candidates you're looking for?
We've had very good panelists. We do sometimes have to call superintendents and ask them to ensure that they have nominated someone. We sometimes struggle with particular areas of the state getting nominations, but for the most part, my experience has been that the panelists are extremely knowledgeable about the standards. In fact, I have just really been blown away at how well our teachers know the standards, and also are able to very articulately speak about what their students can do.
And then Dr. Lane, can you explain or talk to us? I think I remember, but just to help us since it's back on our discussion now, how do you then look at your recommendation based and to provide it to us? What are some factors you consider? What is your thinking behind that?
Well, in addition to the data here, I asked the team to do some projection of what they think pass rates will be to make sure that whatever the final outcome for student performance isn't unreasonably low based on what we know about student performance, unreasonably high. Theoretically, you could cut the score low enough that everyone would pass. And so we want to make sure that it's really representative of our students. And so certainly in adopting the NGOF procedure, we rely on our teachers to tell us that. The articulation committee's recommendation is obviously a very strong barometer for me, and I look at both, plus that data that I suggested. And then another factor that I consider is there is some belief as you raise the cut scores that students and schools and teachers adjust instruction to the higher level of rigor, and therefore can lead to better outcomes for our students in the long run by setting a higher standard. And so I try to weigh very carefully if our standard is too low or if it's going to hold us back from setting high expectations for our students. And so there's no one thing necessarily that I consider, but really all of that in aggregate is where I land. When of course I didn't mention the psychometricians. I certainly believe that this process having been completed several times since 1998, I also try to weigh very carefully if we're changing the level of rigor of the assessment and use feedback that I've gotten in the field around whether the last cut score was, considered too rigorous or too low. And we did hear, as an example, that grade 4 last time was potentially more rigorous than what teachers felt in the field was appropriate. And so when they pulled down the recommendation, of course, with the 20 out of 50 and then articulation committee coming back up at 25, I wanted my recommendation to be even higher than that because I wanted to make sure that whereas we were being responsive around rigor, that we were not going too far. And as promised to the board last year, for this math specifically, which is not the topic of today, we're setting you up for English, but we do plan in the early winter, spring, to bring you the results of the math assessments. Last year, you had asked for us to do that. You had asked us to study a little bit around whether we could bring you a national norm comparison, and we are not going to be prepared to do that. Really didn't feel comfortable with the national norm set in comparison to our assessments.
Just ask, maybe it's for James instead, Shelley. I guess if you believe in the underlying philosophy of the process, you're basically determining the cut scores by essentially a focus group of experts. And putting your overlay on it really, in a sense, is contrary to the underlying philosophy of the integrity of the process. Which I'm not saying that makes it wrong. I'm just, and then when I hear you speak about, well, if we have, essentially higher cut scores, we might be providing an incentive, leads me to question, what are we viewing as the purpose of these tests? Are we using them to improve performance? Are we using them for diagnosis, essentially, and what is the perception of how we're using these tests? In other words, is it right, let's assume we are succeeding in the mission and people are actually learning more. Is it right to artificially keep the pass rate lower because you believe it will increase the, learning at the classroom level? Or should we celebrate the fact that we're actually getting across whatever it is the standards of third grade reading are supposed to be, or third grade math? You don't need to answer all this today, but as we go through the cut score process, it does seem, if you read about this stuff, that your layer of it really, in a sense, and I don't mean you specifically, but putting an administrative overlay onto the otherwise expert setting method sort of impacts negatively the integrity of the method for what it's supposed to be measuring.
Well, I think it's important for the superintendent to make recommendations, and as part of the process. And if I'm going to be asked to make a recommendation, I'm going to weigh in. But I will say, I think that all of the steps in the process, in my opinion, are important because they continue to leave layers for controls to make sure that something is not getting out of whack or unreasonable. And certainly if the board thinks that I adjust something too high, we're not expecting you to rubber stamp my recommendation in any way.
I guess the issue, though, we have no way of knowing, right? We don't see the tests. We don't see the standards in which the tests are supposed to be based on. I mean, I guess we could see the test, but it still wouldn't help most of us. I mean, there's a few maybe, but overall, I mean, the reason you impanel the experts is because they're able to say, yeah, the marginally proficient or the marginally capable student will either A, be able to answer this question correctly, or B, not. Or the other way I guess they do it is they take what percentage of students do you think would be able to do it in some settings, and then they use those for the Angolf method to, either the median or the mean to determine what the cut scores ought to be. But I guess back to, sort of the more fundamental point is, what are you looking to these tests? I mean, systemically, and I guess I ought to know this, after a couple of years doing this, but what are we looking for these tests to do? I mean, we tend to say we don't like high stakes testing for accreditation, so I'm assuming we're backing away from that as the purpose. Where are we going? I mean, and if it's just to increase, instruction, which I think is a good thing, by the way, are there other ways that we have to incentivize jurisdictions to improve the instructional capability without just saying, well, gee, you're going to now fail these tests because you're not doing this rigorously enough?
Well, I will answer from my perspective for sure, but I will say that's part of what we're asking you is to tell us what the tests are to be used for. But I will say I believe that the standards of learning assessments are primarily should primarily be used for the diagnosis of
We're in agreement there.
where schools are struggling that might need more resources to support students. I will say that many schools do use these assessments as a rating of teacher effectiveness. I believe that there are many schools that do use these assessments for sorting students into programs, and I don't believe that they were intended for that purpose, but that does happen. But I also believe that we have a responsibility to ensure that the level of rigor is moving in a direction that maximizes our students' potential, and that notion that we're diagnosing from schools how students are doing, in part is a barometer that's set by the board. But I will say we are often, as a state, compared against, say, a NAEP standard and others, and every other state and every one of these national standards. And I said I'm not really completely ready to tell you where we benchmark against that, because I want to do a lot more study on it, and some of the organizations that provide those type of metrics don't necessarily align to some of what we're doing. But as NAEP has always been an aspirational metric, and Shelley can talk more about NAEP as an aspirational metric, I do believe that as their standards become more aspirational, it's important for us to do so as well, or our students are going to be left behind in comparison to students in other states.
Yeah, Ms. Atkinson, then Ms. Holton, I'm sorry.
So-
The other way.
One of the values that I find in getting a recommendation from the superintendent is as follows. While the articulation committee also sees the impact of setting the scores, the superintendent does. And the thing about the superintendent versus the articulation committee is the superintendent should have a fairly good handle about what's happening across the Commonwealth, but also what's happened historically. I mean, that's the information, sort of the department, that we know that when we institute new tests, we typically see a downturn in the scores, except for this year. But that kind of knowledge that individual would have, I think I'm depending upon that to inform me as a board member, because I don't have access to all that information.
Okay, well, let me just ask, and I'm not putting you on the spot, but I do have a question about that. And again, this is not about whether we should receive his recommendation or not. It really goes more to, let's assume Dr. Lane walked in and said, and we've certainly talked about this, if I increase the cut score, I believe we will increase the quality of teaching in the Commonwealth. Okay, so now you separate that a little bit from, I'm looking to diagnose where the marginally proficient or marginally capable third grader is. If that's the reason we're accepting the superintendent's recommendation, are we really telling the public that these tests are no longer really diagnostic, but they are in fact educational themselves?
I think
And are we
since,
prepared to do that? I mean,
well, I would say since the tests are based on our standards of learning, and I would consider those expectations to be what we as a board believe our students should learn. And let's be honest, since we first did them in the 90s to now, we've increased those expectations, and we are well aware of what's happening across the country, what our students are needing to be able to learn in order to be competitive. I don't see a disjunction between those two things. I think because they're based on the standards, that they would in fact be doing both those roles. Does that make sense to you?
the words make sense. I think it doesn't fit in with the way I view this right now, because I think, again, if the goal is to measure where the minimally proficient, student is, that might put the cut score here, and they would pass whatever percentage we think is appropriate of the third grade or the whatever grade, SOLs. Now, that to me is one measure. The second is, well, we really want to be up here, right? Because we think, and that's no longer the minimally proficient. That's now we're saying you got to be a little bit higher on the chain in order to meet what we are now considering minimally proficient.
We've been doing that the past 20 years.
And I guess what I'm asking is that really where we want to be? I mean, we're testing basically every kid. We can already predict with some certainty without these tests where they're going to be. Are we achieving the goals we're looking to achieve? We now have a whole class of schools that under the old accreditation system would have been considered, failures. Were they really failures in terms of the minimally competent, or were they failures in terms of they were unable to accelerate their kids past minimally competent? I honestly don't know that now. And, the more you understand about what this measures, the less certain I am about what goals we're serving by doing what we're doing. And I understand we have the federal mandate for this. I mean, I get all that. I'm not suggesting we do away with all of it, but I'm wondering, what we're really using them for compared to what we're telling people we're using them for. Is there any generalized understanding of what we're doing here? I'm not feeling it right now, but I could be convinced. And again, it's not to say that James' attitude toward this is wrong. It's not the pitch. The pitch is to really think about what it is we're doing and, what we're looking to accomplish with what we're doing. And it's not clear to me right now that we are accomplishing with what we say we're doing, what it is we say we want to accomplish. Not clear. I mean, I'm happy to be educated as to why that's not right. And Ms. Holton, I know you had a comment. I scared you off of it. I didn't mean to.
Mr. Geiger, could I add a little context?
Sure.
I'm thinking back to the purpose of the test originally. And I think the standards of learning themselves were supposed to set a minimum expectation for students. And so I guess historically, the tests really have had a dual purpose, both to ensure that students across the Commonwealth had a minimal level of achievement in a particular content area. And then also, as you and Dr. Lane have said, to help identify schools that were not providing sufficient instruction to make sure that students achieved that level. Before the initial tests were administered, you all adopted policy level definitions of proficient and advanced, and I'm trying to do them from memory. I think proficient was reasonable attainment of the standards. And I think what you meant by that was that students should have attained the knowledge and skills in that particular content area to be able to move on to the next grade level. And when we talk about the performance level descriptors that I discussed earlier, those performance level descriptors really are the teacher's explication of what they view as necessary to be grade level proficient. Dr. Lane mentioned NAEP, and NAEP proficient is aspirational. It's not grade level proficient. It is what you would want the very best fourth grader who is proficient to be able to know and be able to do. I think in Virginia, you as a board have adopted cut scores and standards that did meet that definition of grade level proficiency, both for the benefit of ensuring that students had a minimal level of proficiency, but also identifying schools where assistance was needed. I personally think that you are to be commended for not being overly concerned about impact data. There are many states that set their cut scores on their state tests by looking at where they fall in terms of proficient on NAEP. And then they set the cut scores so that the same number of students are proficient on the state test as are on NAEP. If we did that in Virginia, our pass rate would be very, very low. So while what you do as a board to adopt cut scores is quite a bit different from the way the rest of the country does this, having done this for 21 years now, I commend you for the fact that you focus mostly on content. To the comments about Dr. Lane's review of the impact data, I think there's always that tension in ensuring that the decisions you're making are based on experts, but also ensuring that you don't adopt cut scores that are going to put you and the rest of the Commonwealth in a bad position. And I think his review of that impact data does serve you well in that regard. And Mr. Gecker, I have not yet worked with the superintendent who has moved the cut scores very much from what articulation recommended. So I appreciate your willingness to let me opine for a moment.
Yeah, and I'll just add one other piece
I'm
of
willing to
context.
rely on the experts, Shelley.
I'll add one other piece of context that really impacted my decision on math last year. And I'm not sure that if there was more historical precedent, I would not have considered an even higher level of rigor than we went with. In fact, I know I probably would have. But when, for instance, fourth grade came out of articulation was recommending 20 out of 50. And in grade 3, they were recommending 20 out of 40. I just, having some expertise in working directly with students in elementary schools, I just cannot believe that 50% correct is the metric that we wanted to set. And so that was one of the reasons I adjusted it up last year specifically. And still not sure that I would not have gone further had I known that for certain the impact data that we now know, which we'll share with you in the upcoming new year. And so I think that the department being able to weigh in with some reasonability is always going to be good for everyone to consider.
Okay. Anything else? If not, thank you.
Thank you.
I'd say you were proficient.
Well, thank you very much.
Advanced proficient. Thank you. Oops. Dr. Lane wanted you to be advanced.
I set that cut score for sure.
Yes. Okay. Yeah, we'll keep rolling, I guess. You okay, keep rolling? Okay. Okay, Dr. Wallace.
I actually have
But yeah, James wanted to introduce some people.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Wallace. Dr. Wallace is here to talk to you about alternative accreditation plans. Last month, you had mentioned wanting to gain a little bit more information on this process, and knowing that you'll have some reviews here at the board meeting tomorrow. I think it's really important to remind you of what alternative accreditation plans are. Before I do that, last month we introduced Julie Malik, our new Director of Accountability. I have a couple other new folks that I wanted to introduce. And the first is Dr. Linda Rivia, who's in the back. Dr. Rivia is our interim Director of School Quality, and so is replacing Bev Rabel as we seek our permanent candidate. We made a decision in the middle of the search to go with an interim, but we chose to ask Linda to remain with us the entire year. And one of the things that we have asked her to do is to really use this year to build out, based on evidence-based models and research, the ideal school quality program. Not that we didn't already have it, but just a new, fresh set of eyes on it. And having been the superintendent in Stanton and had some of her schools go through the process, we thought she brought really unique perspective. And so wanted to introduce you to Dr. Rivia, and certainly later in the year, we'll hopefully announce a permanent candidate. I also wanted to share with you that we did name a new Assistant Superintendent for Curriculum Instruction to replace Gina Keller, who also retired. And we have announced that Dr. Michael Bowling will be in that role. You may remember Dr. Bowling, or Mr. Bowling, excuse me. Mr. Bowling, as a former member of the curriculum instruction team here over mathematics and governor schools. And he's most recently been the principal of Code RVA. And then I think she stepped out, but we also have expanded the size of our equity team. Of course, that Leah leads that team, Leah Walker. Janae Nurse, who you may remember was a Fulbright scholar, finished her Fulbright and is now back with us in that role as coordinator of equity. And so when Janae comes back in, she was sitting over here. I just wanted to make sure you remembered who she was. But in the meantime, with one of those new people in the room, Dr. Rivia, thank you for joining our team and appreciate all the work that you're going to do. And Michelle works on that team and is going to share some of that information.
Greetings, President Gecker, Vice President Atkinson, members of the board, and Dr. Lane, thank you for having me. The alternative accreditation plans represent a small number of schools in Virginia that have special circumstances. Many of you are familiar with the alternative accreditation plans. These schools either serve a special population of students, including adult learners, or they serve small graduating classes, or they also have alternative settings for learners based on the historical needs of that particular school. The SOA allow for provisions for special purpose schools as well as high schools that have a small graduation cohort of 50 or fewer. And the applications that you'll be reviewing for tomorrow represent both the GCI. We call those GCI because they represent the small graduating class that has to meet the graduation and completion index. And then our special purpose applications. And those are our special purpose schools that serve special populations of students. Since the SOAs were updated in 2017, this did not change. However, the school quality indicators did change. And so their applications had to be revised. So some of them were kind of in the middle of their application cycle. You may have remembered just looking at them a couple of years ago. And now they are renewing those applications so that they can address the new changes to the standards of accreditation. So the first set of applications that you'll look at will involve the GCI of small. GCI changed to 88. It was 85. And so these applications essentially stayed the same. There were a couple of criteria that had to be deleted because we used, some of them used the VPI, Virginia Performance Index award system as part of their criteria. But as you know, that criteria also has been replaced in the standards. And so that was deleted from some of the applications. But essentially, these applications remain the same, and the plan's criteria are only used if a school falls below the 88 GCI. And they also have to have the graduating class of 50 or fewer. So in their applications, they do include the numbers of students at each grade level. And that grade level, you'll notice as you look through the applications, may change. They might have 14 students in one grade level and 25 students in another grade level. And, that just fluctuates. And that's the nature of those schools, which is why they have these special applications. Special purpose schools are evaluated based on their programs that they offer, and these vary. So some are adult learning programs, some are alternative settings for students with special needs or for students with special circumstances. Their applications are a little bit more detailed because they're covering all of the provisions of the standards as well as all of the school quality indicators. They're choosing which school quality indicators that they are addressing based on the calculation. But essentially, their applications will give you a background of the school, who they serve, what they represent, how they ensure quality instruction is happening in classrooms, how they meet the standards of learning, and how they would like to propose that their calculation be different for alternative accreditation. So the school quality indicators, this slide just is a refresher for you, just to remind you of the different school quality indicators that are covered within those special purpose applications. And then again, if the school chooses not to address one of them, they use the calculation that Virginia has already established. So their applications essentially have a certain calculation that they have determined locally based on the services that they offer in their school, as well as the special needs and special populations of their schools. So all of their applications will look quite different. We began this process prior to last May, but in May, we held a webinar with our stakeholders. So all of the divisions that are represented in the two different types of applications were asked to attend a webinar and provide input on the application process. So we did reach out to them, and there were some good questions that resulted from that. In June, we offered the actual application and what that process would look like. The process itself did not change much. The school quality indicators, of course, are what needed to be added. So we did consult with policy as well as research here at VDOE to review that application and make sure that we were covering all of the bases required for the standards of accreditation. In September, applications were due, and then we have been reviewing those applications and working with school divisions for any modifications that were necessary between September and October. And then, of course, once you review this, it'll be on first review for tomorrow, and then approval in January. After the applications do get final approval, whether they need revisions or not, they will be used to determine the school's accreditation status for this year. So those schools, some of them actually are accredited because they're accredited with the waiver. So they have the 3-year waiver in place, and so they're already accredited because they were accredited for the previous 3 years. And so their accreditation status remains as accredited. And then some of them have the accreditation status right now as pending.
Refuse to participate in this.
And the pending status, of course, would be updated, but we'll review all school quality indicators according to their school's applications and update the status of those. Any questions?
Are there any questions? I think you have been
All right.
so complete, there are no questions.
Well, I feel successful.
Thank you very
Let
much.
me get away from here really quick.
Advanced
You get advanced.
Yeah.
or proficient advanced,
Yes.
whatever you want to call it.
All righty, thank you.
Thank you. And finally. We taking a break or? We're rolling? We're rolling? Yeah, that's fine.
Hopefully it's short.
Mm-hmm.
Let's go for advanced. Let's go for advanced. Good afternoon, Mr. President, members of the board, and Dr. Lane. I'm pleased to discuss with you today the board's 2019 annual report on the conditions and needs of public schools in Virginia. This report is required by Section 22.1-18 of the Code of Virginia, which outlines the requirements of the report, including the current standards of quality, information on student and parent choice, including charter school and virtual school options, as well as a report on the reports that local school divisions are required to submit to the state and federal government. This annual report presents the needs of public education in Virginia, an update on the board's work over the past year, including the newly prescribed standards of quality, and a summary of achievement of students in schools. Since first review, there have been several updates to the report. On pages 4 and 5, an executive summary has been added. On pages 8 and 9, additional historical information has been added about the standards of quality and past board and General Assembly action. On page 13, the data on unfilled teacher positions has been expanded to include 10 years of data, which is the most that we have at this point. On pages 16 and 17, a section has been added about major board accomplishments and actions over the past year beyond the standards of quality. On page 22, more context has been added to the data on suspension and expulsions. And throughout the document, several technical updates have been made based on feedback from members of the work session in October. Additionally, all required reports in the appendices have been finalized. I did receive a comment this week from Ms. Holton about the recent NAEP results being featured more prominently in the report. It's currently under the bulleted list of achievements. I am working with staff to include it in the summary of achievement section, but give it its own heading similar to the suspension and expulsion data. And I plan to have a draft section for you all to review tomorrow. I've pulled some additional charts that we have from the press release and some other data, and we hope to have that ready for you to look at tomorrow. With that, I'll open it up for questions and discussions about the report.
Any questions or discussion?
And I will say, before we finalize and send to the governor, there will be another thorough edit of the more technical where we may have a spelling error or, commas, things like that.
We'll say that although the statute has the date, the Constitution actually is the primary requirement, that we submit a report annually to the governor and the General Assembly. And as you know, I always think hearkening back to our constitutional obligations and role is a good and positive thing. Which is not to say you need to make the change, but
Yeah.
just so we're all aware,
Absolutely.
and at some point, we've raised a couple other obligations we have, the superintendent's list, which does not for this, but I expect that we'll get to at some point, as well as that report that we're required to do periodically about are the divisions of schools serving the appropriate purpose, which again, I don't think we've ever done.
I will note that along with the policy staff, we went and combed the Constitution and the code to make sure that everything that is required in the annual report has been done.
Good.
For instance, there needs to be a thorough review of all of the SOQs and the reasoning for them. That has been done, which had not been done in that manner in the past. So we have tried to
I appreciate
dot
that
every
a lot.
I and cross every T to make sure that this is exactly what is required.
Great, thank you. All right, any comments or questions? Yes, Dr. Duran.
Just one comment and wondering, on page 11, under changing student enrollment,
Yes.
I do appreciate the reference to the increase in English language learners. I know in our SRQ discussion, we talked about the fact that SIFE students is something we don't gather data for, but it is one that anecdotally we know, and in some divisions we do know, has been a tremendous increase and is showing more and more of a need for us to address that. So I guess my question, I don't know have the right answer right now, but I could help you think about the wording, but I would love to see some reference to the notion that we do need to better understand that population and the impact it is having with regards to that increase for our English language learners. I think this is a good opportunity in our report to share with the governor and the General Assembly that this is a population that is very unique, but yet it is growing, and it has a major impact on our changing student enrollment.
Sure. Happy to add that.
Yeah, please.
I have a process question.
Sure.
Emily, thanks for all of the work you and everyone else has done to pull this together. Certainly, we know that once the edits are done, we forward this to the governor and to the General Assembly. But if you could articulate, or someone could articulate, how our work around the standards of quality outside of the mention of those things here in the document, in the report, how do those two pieces travel together, perhaps, through the next phase of the process?
So we obviously have to transmit the annual report through this process, and that is also supposed to include any revisions to the standards of quality that the board has. Separate from that, we are working on a transmittal letter that is in the final stages and will be going to President Gecker next for his approval, since it is his signature that goes on it, that will transmit your SOQs separately from the annual report, given the gravity of them. How they translate together, I'm not sure exactly. This is a little bit uncharted territory for us. I think that's something we need to figure out, where, how the board advocates for the SOQs beyond this transmittal letter.
Thank you.
Sorry, that's not the best answer.
We've just spent, I'm sorry.
So we don't even know the names of the chairs of the education
Yeah.
committees
Right.
or the money committees.
Sure. So just in term generally process, we've spent so much time working through the SOQs and coming to a set of recommendations. I think at every opportunity we can, even if we don't know the detail, our keeping sight of the fact that pieces and parts working together to hopefully end in the place where we all want and need them to end. Just being reminded of that is where I want to make sure that our attention stays.
And, obviously post the election, some things are changing, but actually President Gecker and I talked a little bit about this morning, the SOQ should go to every member, not just the chairs. It should go to the clerk of the House and Senate, obviously Governor Northam and his whole team. So we plan to share it widely. Annual report will continue to go to the governor and the General Assembly, but we plan to share your SOQ revisions, even more broadly.
And I think you mentioned that there might be some interaction between the department and legislative services, at which point, although we would not give them advice how to handle it, we would certainly highlight the fact that the standards were prescribed this time instead of recommended, to again, just to allow the legislative body some
There's definitely some education.
opportunity to respond appropriately.
Yeah, there's definitely some education that needs to be done about, the process that the board has taken this time versus previous years, and I think President Gecker, Ms. Atkinson, they'll be very helpful in helping us communicate that along with other members of the board.
Ms. Holton, and then Ms. Holton.
On the NAEP add-on, thank you for sorry for my last minute comment on that.
Okay.
I don't know and should have paid more attention myself, but do we know from the NAEP results whether our results were down for all demographic groups, or did it vary? In other words, was our drop in our, I think we get our NAEP scores broken down by, not by geography, but by income status and ethnicity.
I know we
And
get
so was
ethnicity.
did we decline over in all categories, or decline more in some categories than in others? Do we know?
So the answer is we declined more in some categories than in others. We pretty much declined everywhere, but we actually did see, even though the overall results were were very concerning. There was some shrinking of achievement gaps in certain areas.
So, so that may be contrary to it, but if our overall scores went down either because we have more poor kids or because poor kids did worse, that might tell a different story
Absolutely.
than if everybody did worse.
And I did meet with Charles Pyle this morning. He is going to share with me some additional charts that he has that kind of break out some of those demographic groups. So we're certainly going to look at that and see how that could translate into your annual report. And obviously, support some of your SOQ revisions around reading specialists, the equity fund, EL teachers, things like that.
Right. And it may be, I know it's all fresh off the press. So it may be for now, all we can say is there was a drop and it's concerning and we're trying to understand it. More teachers will help, more funding
Supports,
resources will help raise the bar for everything. But if it does support an argument on our equity fund, for instance, it would be if we are able to ascertain that quickly enough.
Yeah, we're only planning to put information there that we feel like we can back up with the data. And the department, and Dr. Lane can obviously talk more about this, is planning to provide some technical assistance and resources to school divisions around, reading and literacy, that we can kind of put a little bit of information in here as well on that.
What I will say is when Emily and I went through the draft earlier today, I made the exact comment that you just made. Let's make sure we address how the SOQ revisions were intended to impact results for students on reading assessments. And then if you don't mind, I also asked Emily to provide a list of the types of resources that we provide to school divisions in this area.
Yes, ma'am.
I don't have a question. I just really want to thank you, Emily. I think the organization that you have put into this document, every year it gets a little bit better, but this one really dovetails so well with the work that we've done. And so I just really wanted to tell you how much I appreciate that. I think if they read it, okay, I'll be positive. When they read
Carry
it,
copies with me everywhere I go.
it really will help them understand why we're asking for the changes that we prescribed.
Yeah, I think the changes we made last year with the annual report, dovetailing into the comprehensive plan, have really helped us improve this process over the last couple of years. I was telling staff earlier, I'm really happy with this version. I think it speaks to the work that you all have done over the last year and really highlights the importance of it. So I feel like we're in a pretty good spot.
Yeah, I would echo Diane's comments. You did a great job with this.
Thank you.
I think as we move forward, one of the things that, and with Jenna here today, I think we're going to need to get a little bit more engaged in kindergarten readiness as an impact. One of the things we saw down in Southwest and heard from the superintendent in Southwest was the impact of opioids on kindergarten readiness. I think both at Pam's school, at the superintendent's dinner that night, and next morning at Giles, I think that all came up. I think those are the three places I heard it down there. But I don't want to include the anecdotal, but as we're gathering things for the next year and as we're going through the process, I think we ought to be at least thinking now about dovetailing into kindergarten readiness. One of the points that some of the superintendents were making was even though we have a declining enrollment, our dollar needs are staying constant or increasing because of the changing composition of or the readiness level of those students coming in the younger grades. And I know we have increases in population in other places, but down there it seemed to be universally declining. Don't know if that's accurate, but it felt like it was accurate. Pam, you probably know the enrollment numbers. If you don't, that's okay. I'm not. Yeah, but
overall,
as we
in
move
Region
forward,
7 enrollment is declining.
as we move forward, let's begin to collect now sort of data for next year's report because it'll become important, particularly again if they do the pre-K thing here.
Absolutely.
Anybody else?
Just to say advanced.
There you go. Can we have the superintendents weigh in on the cut score for this? Okay, I guess we
Alrighty.
are adjourned until dinner
Dinner.
at 6.
Yep.
Perfect.
All right.
Thank you.
you.
Thank you. Yeah.
I do remember that. I thought you said bad, and then I realized you said bad.
Doctor.
And I'm like,